March 1945, Camp Perry, Ohio. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood at the perimeter fence of the prisoner of war compound, his hands gripping the cold wire mesh as he stared across the flat terrain toward Lake Erie. Behind him, 300 Japanese naval officers and enlisted men moved through their daily routines in a prison camp that defied everything they had been taught about American brutality. For 2 months, they had received food portions larger than what many had eaten even before their capture. Medical care surpassed what the Imperial Japanese Navy provided its own sailors. And strangest of all, their captors treated them with a courtesy that seemed incomprehensible. But Lieutenant Yamamoto, former navigation officer aboard the cruiser Katori before it went down in the Battle of Truk Lagoon, believed he understood the truth. This careful treatment, this apparent generosity was itself a form of warfare. The Americans were softening them, preparing them for more sophisticated interrogation techniques, or perhaps displaying them as propaganda prizes to boost American morale. He had warned the other officers to remain vigilant, to remember their training, to resist this insidious attempt to compromise their loyalty to the Emperor. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Lieutenant Yamamoto could not have imagined was how completely his certainty would shatter within the next 72 hours, and how a single afternoon visit to an ordinary American institution would force him to confront a reality so overwhelming that it would transform not just his understanding of the conflict, but his entire conception of the society he had been fighting against. The announcement came during morning assembly on March 14th. Captain Robert Morrison, the camp commandant, stood before the assembled prisoners with his usual measured demeanor. Through the interpreter, Technical Sergeant Daniel Nakamura, a Japanese-American from California, he explained that 20 prisoners had been selected for an educational excursion to nearby Port Clinton. They would visit the local public library. Yamamoto listened with growing suspicion. A library. Of all the possible propaganda venues, why would the Americans choose something so mundane? Unless, he reasoned, this was precisely the point. Show them something ordinary, something seemingly innocuous, and use it to plant subtle messages about American superiority. He raised his hand. Through Sergeant Nakamura, he asked why they were being taken to see books when many of the prisoners could not read English. Captain Morrison smiled patiently and explained that the purpose was not to read English books, but to understand how Americans accessed information and education. That evening, Yamamoto gathered with 5 other officers in the barracks assigned to senior prisoners. Lieutenant Kenji Ito, formerly of the destroyer Maikaze, had also been selected for the excursion. So had Lieutenant Junior Grade Hiroshi Tanaka, who had served aboard the submarine I-175. They sat on their bunks in the clean, heated building, so different from the cramped quarters they had known aboard their vessels. "It's a setup," Yamamoto said quietly in Japanese, knowing the guards rarely understood their language. "They want to impress us with some carefully staged display, books arranged for our benefit, perhaps actors pretending to be ordinary citizens." Ito nodded slowly. "We should observe carefully. Note any inconsistencies." Tanaka, younger than the others at just 24 years old, seemed less certain. "But, Commander, what if it is real? What if they simply want to show us something true about their country?" Yamamoto fixed him with a hard stare. "Then we will see through their truth, to the propaganda it conceals. Do not let your guard down." The morning of March 16th dawned clear and cold. The 20 selected prisoners, all officers or senior enlisted men chosen for their English language skills, boarded an army transport truck under guard. They wore their cleaned uniforms, the rising sun insignia removed per Geneva Convention requirements, replaced with simple POW markings. 8 American soldiers accompanied them, rifles held casually, but ready. The drive took 40 minutes along roads that astounded Yamamoto with their quality. Back home in Japan, even major highways showed the strain of conflict, pockmarked and poorly maintained as resources flowed to the military. These American roads, in what appeared to be a secondary region far from major cities, were smooth and well kept. He noted this observation carefully, filing it away as another piece of the puzzle. Port Clinton appeared as they crested a small hill. A town of perhaps 5,000 people, it stretched along the Lake Erie shoreline with modest homes, shops, and churches. Nothing impressive, nothing grand, just an ordinary American community on an ordinary March morning, which made Yamamoto even more suspicious. The truck stopped in front of a brick building 3 stories tall, its architecture typical of the early 20th century. A sign above the entrance read, Ida Rupp Public Library, and below it smaller text declared, Free to all. Captain Morrison gathered them on the sidewalk before entering. Gentlemen, he said through Sergeant Nakamura's translation, what you are about to see is an ordinary American public library. There are thousands like it across our country, some larger, some smaller, but all operating on the same principle. I ask only that you observe with open minds. They entered through heavy wooden doors into a vestibule, then through another set of doors into the main reading room. And there, Yamamoto's careful certainty began its first crack. The room stretched perhaps 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, with high ceilings and tall windows letting in natural light. But it was not the architecture that struck him. It was the books. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, and additional freestanding shelves created aisles throughout the space. Thousands upon thousands of books, their spines facing outward in neat rows, organized by some system that he did not immediately understand. At a desk near the entrance sat a woman perhaps 50 years old, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple dress and cardigan. She looked up as they entered and smiled warmly. Good morning, Captain Morrison, she said. Welcome back, and welcome to your guests. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson, Morrison replied. These gentlemen are here to learn about how American libraries function. Would you mind showing them around? Of course, she said, standing and approaching the group with no visible fear or hesitation. Welcome, gentlemen. I'm Martha Henderson, the head librarian here. Through Nakamura's translation, she began explaining the library's organization. The Dewey Decimal System, she called it, a method of categorizing all human knowledge into 10 main classes, each subdivided further. She walked them through the stacks, pointing out the numbers on the spines. 0 for general works and reference, 100s for philosophy and psychology, 200s for religion, 300s for social sciences. Yamamoto followed, listening carefully, looking for the propaganda angle. But Mrs. Henderson's explanation was straightforward, almost boring in its technical detail. She showed them the card catalogue, a bank of small drawers filled with thousands of index cards, each representing a book in the collection. We have approximately 15,000 volumes at present, she said. Available to any resident of Ottawa County free of charge. You simply present your library card, and you may borrow up to 5 books for 2 weeks. Lieutenant Ito whispered to Yamamoto in Japanese. 15,000 books? In a town of 5,000 people? That's 3 books per person. Yamamoto frowned. The numbers mean nothing if the books themselves are propaganda. But as Mrs. Henderson continued the tour, leading them through different sections, the content of the books began to trouble his theory. Fiction filled several aisles. Everything from popular novels to classic literature. He recognized some titles even in English. Another section held histories, including books about Japan itself. He pulled one from the shelf, published in 1942. You allow people to read about Japan? He asked through Nakamura. Even now during the conflict. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised by the question. Of course. Understanding different cultures and histories is one of the library's primary purposes. We have books about Germany, Italy, China, Russia, all nations. Knowledge should not be restricted by politics. Yamamoto opened the book, expecting propaganda, but the introduction appeared scholarly and relatively objective, discussing Japanese history from the Meiji Restoration forward. It was not necessarily flattering to Japan, but neither was it the crude caricature he had expected. In another section, technical manuals and scientific texts filled the shelves. Chemistry, physics, engineering, medicine. Lieutenant Tanaka, who had training as an electrical engineer before the conflict, pulled out a volume on radio theory and began flipping through it, his eyes widening. Commander, he whispered in Japanese, this is current information. This is not propaganda. This is real technical knowledge. Yamamoto took the book and examined it. Published in 1943, it discussed advanced radio circuit design at a level that matched or exceeded what he had learned in the Imperial Navy's technical schools. He carefully replaced it on the shelf, his mind racing. Mrs. Henderson led them to the children's section, a cheerful area with lower shelves, small tables and chairs, and colorful illustrations on the walls. "We have about 3,000 children's books," she explained. "Reading programs for different age groups. Story hour every Wednesday afternoon." A woman sat in one corner with a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, reading together from a picture book. The boy looked up at the group of foreign prisoners with curiosity, but no apparent fear. His mother smiled and nodded a greeting. "Do all American towns have such places?" Yamamoto asked through the interpreter. "Most do," Morrison interjected. Andrew Carnegie, a wealthy industrialist, donated money to build thousands of libraries across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This building was funded partially by his foundation in 1903, but the principle is older. Americans have believed in public libraries since Benjamin Franklin started the first subscription library in 1731. That was 114 years before this moment, longer than the Meiji era, longer than Japan had been a modern nation. "And anyone may use them?" Yamamoto pressed. "Not just the wealthy?" "Anyone," Mrs. Henderson confirmed. "Rich, poor, educated, uneducated, men, women, children. We have farmers who come in to read agricultural journals, factory workers who check out technical manuals to improve their skills, housewives who borrow cookbooks and novels, children doing school research. Everyone is welcome." She led them upstairs to the second floor, where reference materials dominated the space. Encyclopedias, atlases, dictionaries, periodicals. A long table held recent newspapers from various cities. Yamamoto noticed that the newspapers included information about the conflict, but not exclusively. Sports scores, business reports, social announcements, everything that made up ordinary civilian life, continued alongside the global struggle. On the third floor, they found meeting rooms and a small auditorium. Community groups use these spaces, Mrs. Henderson explained. Book clubs, civic organizations, educational lectures. Last month, we hosted a presentation by a botany professor from Ohio State University about native plants. Back on the main floor, Mrs. Henderson showed them the circulation desk, where books were checked out and returned. A simple system of stamps and cards tracked each transaction. "We process about 200 borrowings per week," she said. "More in summer when children are out of school. 200 per week, 10,400 per year, from a town of 5,000. Yamamoto did the mathematics automatically. That meant the average person borrowed 2 books annually. But if, as Mrs. Henderson indicated, some people borrowed nothing while others borrowed regularly, then the regular patrons must be consuming far more." An older man approached the desk, nodded politely to the group of prisoners, and asked Mrs. Henderson about a book on beekeeping. She checked the card catalogue, informed him they had 2 such books, one currently checked out, but due back in 3 days, the other available on the shelf. He thanked her and went to find it. "He's a farmer," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "trying to establish bee colonies to improve his crop pollination, using knowledge from books to solve practical problems. That's what libraries do." Lieutenant Ito spoke up through Nakamura. "In Japan, such knowledge would be expensive. Books cost more than most workers earn in a week. Only wealthy families or institutions can afford extensive libraries." "That was true here once too," Morrison said. "The library movement changed that. The belief that an educated citizenry benefits everyone, so education should be freely accessible, not just schools, but the tools for lifelong learning." They spent another 30 minutes in the library. Yamamoto and several other officers explored different sections, pulling books at random, checking publication dates, examining content. History, literature, science, philosophy, religion, practical manuals, children's stories, everything organized and accessible. No obvious propaganda, no staged displays, just books, tens of thousands of them, available to anyone who walked through the door. As they prepared to leave, a thought struck Yamamoto. He approached Mrs. Henderson through the interpreter. "How is this funded?" he asked. "Who pays for the building, the books, your salary?" "Taxpayers," she replied simply. "Ottawa County residents pay property taxes, and a portion goes to maintaining the library. It's written into Ohio law. Every county must provide library services to its residents." "The people tax themselves to buy books for each other?" "Essentially, yes. We also receive some state funding and private donations, but the core support comes from the community, for the community." The return drive to Camp Perry occurred in near silence. The prisoners sat lost in thought, processing what they had seen. Yamamoto stared out the truck's canvas cover at the passing Ohio countryside, his mind churning through implications he was not yet ready to accept. That evening, he could not eat the dinner provided by the camp kitchen, though it was, as always, generous. He sat on his bunk while other officers gathered around, wanting to hear about the library visit. Lieutenant Tanaka spoke first, his voice hesitant. "I have been thinking about what we saw today in our training. We were told that America was a nation of materialistic people who valued only money and possessions, that they were weak, soft, unprepared for sacrifice." "That is what we were told," Yamamoto agreed quietly. "But people who tax themselves to give books to each other, who build thousands of such buildings across their country, who believe that knowledge should be free to all citizens, that does not match what we were told." Lieutenant Ito raised an objection. "Perhaps it is still propaganda. Perhaps they showed us one exceptional library, not representative of the whole." "Captain Morrison said there are thousands like it," Yamamoto replied. He was very specific, not just in cities but in small towns throughout the country. Another officer, Lieutenant Commander Masao Fujimoto, who had been the gunnery officer on the battleship Congo, spoke up. "I have been in this camp for 4 months. Every week, American guards bring newspapers and magazines that have been cleared by censors. I have read them carefully. They contain criticism of the government, complaints about rationing, debates about strategy, arguments about the future. No newspaper in Japan would dare publish such things. Perhaps those too are propaganda," someone suggested. Fujimoto shook his head. "But to what purpose? We are already captured. They do not need to convince us of anything. So why the elaborate deception?" The barracks fell silent. Finally, Yamamoto spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Unless it is not propaganda. Unless it is simply truth." The words hung in the air like smoke. To speak them felt like betrayal, yet Yamamoto could not deny what logic demanded. If the library was propaganda, it was remarkably elaborate and pointless. If the newspapers were staged, they included absurd amounts of trivial detail that served no obvious purpose. "We were told Americans were weak," Tanaka said slowly. "But a nation that builds thousands of libraries, that educates its entire population, that allows free debate and criticism even during conflict, that shares knowledge openly rather than hoarding it, is that weakness or strength?" Another officer, Lieutenant Yuki Watanabe from the heavy cruiser Aoba, added his observation. "I worked in the camp workshop last week, repairing tools. The American sergeant supervising us could barely read. He struggled with the repair manual, but he owned that manual. It was his personal property, purchased from the manufacturer. When I asked him why, he said any mechanic needed good reference books. A barely literate enlisted man owned technical manuals for self-improvement. In Japan, such manuals would be institutional property," Ito noted, "controlled by the military or corporations, not owned by individual workers." "That is my point," Watanabe continued. "The Americans assume that individuals should have access to knowledge. They build their entire society around that assumption. Libraries, public schools, newspapers, affordable books, all structured so that information flows as freely as possible to as many people as possible." Yamamoto stood and walked to the window, looking out at the campgrounds. Other barracks stood in neat rows, housing enlisted prisoners, a recreation yard where men played volleyball and exercised, a medical clinic where American doctors treated everything from minor ailments to serious illnesses with the same techniques used on American soldiers. All of it, every structure, every system, every interaction, reflected the same underlying assumption: that individuals mattered, that their well-being was important, that they possessed inherent worth regardless of nationality or status. And if that was true, if Americans truly believed such things and built their society around such beliefs, then what did it mean about the conflict they had been fighting? What did it mean about the society that had sent them to fight? "I need air," Yamamoto said abruptly, and walked outside. The campgrounds were quiet in the evening. Guards walked their perimeter rounds, but they nodded acknowledgement rather than challenge as Yamamoto stood in the open area between barracks. The spring air still carried winter's chill, but he barely noticed. In his mind, he replayed everything he'd been taught about Americans, that they were individualistic to the point of selfishness, that they lacked the spiritual depth of Japanese culture, that they valued material wealth above honor and duty, that they were racially inferior, mongrels who had built technological sophistication but lacked the soul of a true civilization. The library demolished every assumption. People who taxed themselves to buy books for each other were not selfish individualists. A culture that made knowledge freely available to all citizens was not spiritually shallow. A society that built thousands of libraries, maintained them through generations, and wrote laws requiring their existence was not focused solely on material wealth. And the racial theories? He had seen Americans of every background in the camp: white soldiers from the Midwest, Sergeant Nakamura, Japanese ancestry, but thoroughly American in bearing and belief, black soldiers who served alongside whites. The diversity itself contradicted the racial purity theories he had been taught. But more than that, the Americans had fought and won. They had destroyed the Japanese fleet at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. They had retaken the Philippines. They were pushing toward the home islands. American submarines had strangled Japan's maritime supply lines. American industry had outproduced Japan by ratios that seemed impossible, yet the evidence floated on every ocean. A society that educated its population, that valued knowledge, that allowed free debate and criticism, had proven itself devastatingly effective. All the spiritual training, all the emphasis on sacrifice and loyalty, all the traditions that Japan prized, had not been enough against American industrial and organizational superiority. And that superiority, Yamamoto now understood, flowed directly from the assumptions he had seen embodied in that library. Educated citizens became educated workers, engineers, scientists, soldiers. Knowledge freely shared became innovation widely distributed. Debate and criticism generated better ideas and solutions. The very things that Japan's militaristic culture dismissed as weakness were sources of American strength. Footsteps approached. Captain Morrison walked up beside him, alone except for a guard maintaining discreet distance. "Sergeant Nakamura said you seemed troubled after the library visit," Morrison said in English. Yamamoto understood enough to follow without translation. "I am reconsidering," Yamamoto replied carefully in his limited English. "Many things." Morrison nodded. "The library affects Japanese prisoners that way. We've been taking groups there for 6 months now, always the same response. Shock, confusion, then quiet contemplation. Why show us?" Yamamoto asked. "What purpose?" Morrison considered the question. "Because you're intelligent officers who will someday return to Japan, because understanding is more powerful than propaganda, because we want you to see that Americans are not demons, and maybe if you see that clearly enough, future conflicts might be avoided." "You think we will have influence after the conflict?" Yamamoto asked skeptically. "Someone will," Morrison replied. "Japan will need to rebuild, to rethink its path. Officers who understand that other societies have strengths worth learning from might help that process." After Morrison left, Yamamoto remained outside for another hour. The food quantities that exceeded expectations, the medical care that saved men who would have died in Japanese prisoner camps, the respect shown even to defeated enemies, the Geneva Convention rules that Americans followed meticulously despite Japan's own failure to ratify or observe them. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. American strength was not accidental or temporary. It was structural, built into their society's basic assumptions about human worth and potential. Over the following weeks, Yamamoto began studying English more seriously, using books provided by the camp education program. He read American newspapers, slowly at first, but with increasing fluency. He attended camp lectures on American history and government. He talked with guards who were willing to explain their society's institutions. And he talked with other officers, particularly those like Lieutenant Tanaka, who were also struggling to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught. They formed a discussion group that met several evenings per week, analyzing their observations and trying to understand the implications for Japan's future. Lieutenant Ito remained skeptical for a time, arguing that they were being manipulated. But gradually, the accumulating evidence wore down his resistance. The consistency of American behavior, the depth of institutional structures, the obvious authenticity of ordinary interactions, all pointed toward truth rather than deception. In May, another group visited the library, and this time Yamamoto went along again. Mrs. Henderson welcomed him back and showed him how to use the card catalogue. He spent 3 hours pulling books at random, checking their publication dates, reading passages, trying to find evidence of propaganda or manipulation. He found none. Just books, organized and accessible, covering every subject he could imagine. He found books on naval architecture, on Pacific history, on democracy, on economics, on philosophy, on religion, representing multiple viewpoints and perspectives. Before leaving, he asked Mrs. Henderson how she had become a librarian. "I went to library school at Western Reserve University in Cleveland," she explained. 2 years of training in cataloging, reference services, library management. Ohio requires professional certification for head librarians. "The state requires education for managing books?" Yamamoto asked through an interpreter. "Yes," she replied. "We take it seriously. Libraries are important civic institutions. They need to be run by people trained in how to organize and provide access to information. A state requirement for library certification, professional training programs at universities, institutional standards maintained across thousands of locations. The depth of commitment to the principle of accessible knowledge was staggering. As weeks became months and the conflict ground toward its inevitable conclusion, news filtered into the camp of developments in the Pacific. Each report made clearer what the library had already taught. American material and organizational superiority would prevail. When news of the surrender came in August, Yamamoto felt less surprise than resignation. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment American industrial capacity had been fully mobilized. Perhaps from even earlier, from the moment Japan had chosen conflict with a nation that educated its entire population and gave them free access to accumulated human knowledge. The processing for repatriation took months. During that time, Yamamoto continued his English studies and his observations of American society. He attended lectures by American educators who came to the camp to prepare prisoners for return home. He read extensively about Japanese history from Western perspectives. In February 1946, he stood once more at the perimeter fence, but this time looking inward at the camp. In a week, he would board a transport ship for Japan. The country he would return to bore little resemblance to the one he had left. Occupied, transformed, facing wholesale reconstruction, not just of buildings, but of institutions and beliefs. Lieutenant Tanaka found him there. "What will you do when we return?" Tanaka asked. "I think Japan needs to learn what we learned here, not just about technology or industry, but about the foundations that make those things possible." "You mean libraries?" "I mean the beliefs that create libraries, that knowledge should be free, that individuals have worth, that education benefits everyone, that diversity of thought produces better solutions than imposed uniformity, that criticism and debate strengthen rather than weaken institutions." Tanaka nodded slowly. "Those ideas will be difficult in Japan. Our culture values hierarchy, obedience, conformity." "Our culture valued those things," Yamamoto corrected, "but our culture also adapts. We did it during the Meiji Restoration when we modernized in a single generation. We can do it again. We must do it again." The week passed. The transport ship left from a port in California, carrying hundreds of repatriated prisoners across the Pacific they had fought to control. Yamamoto stood on deck watching the American coastline disappear, thinking about small-town libraries and the society they represented. Japan did rebuild, in ways that surprised even optimistic observers. The nation transformed itself in less than a generation. Libraries became public institutions, accessible to all. Education expanded dramatically. Debate and criticism, once dangerous, became accepted parts of civic life. The changes were not without struggle or setbacks, but the direction was clear. Yamamoto became a teacher. He never commanded another ship. Instead, he spent 35 years educating young Japanese about the world beyond their islands, about the importance of freely accessible knowledge, about the dangers of believing propaganda that dehumanized other peoples. He told his students about the day he visited an ordinary American library in an ordinary Ohio town and learned that everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong, not because Americans were perfect or their society without flaws, but because the fundamental assumptions he had made about American weakness and Japanese superiority had been revealed as hollow propaganda. Some students understood immediately, others required more time. But gradually, a generation grew up that measured Japanese success not against what they had believed about their own uniqueness, but against what they had learned from observing other societies' strengths. The Ida Rupp Public Library in Port Clinton, Ohio, still operates today. It moved to a new, larger building in 1972, expanded again in 2004. It serves a community grown to around 6,000 residents and continues the mission established over a century ago, making knowledge freely accessible to all. Mrs. Martha Henderson retired as head librarian in 1952. She never knew the full impact of the tours she conducted for Japanese prisoners during the conflict. She simply continued doing her job, explaining the library's operations to curious visitors, believing, as she always had, that knowledge and understanding could bridge any divide. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto died in 1992 at the age of 74. At his funeral, former students spoke about his dedication to education, his emphasis on critical thinking, his insistence that propaganda from any source was a danger to genuine understanding. None of them knew the story of the library visit that had transformed his thinking. But in his papers, found after his death, was a journal entry dated March 16, 1945. It read in English he had taught himself to write. Today I saw that Americans build thousands of temples to knowledge and understanding, available to all citizens, regardless of wealth or status. We have been fighting a society that values learning for its entire population, not just its elite. Now I understand why we are losing. Now I understand what Japan must become if we are to have any future worth building. The entry concluded with a single line. They call it just a library. I call it the end of an illusion. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.